Start. So welcome everyone. This is the 10th digital discovery session that we're hosting. My name is David Jensen, for those that don't know me, and I'm UNEP's interim digital transformation coordinator. Now we have a marvelous session today that is going to focus on the digital transformation journey of the UN Development Program. And this will be led by our friend and dear colleague, Robert Opp, who is UNDP's Chief Digital Officer. Now, we had initially announced that Gina Lucarelli from UNDP's Accelerator Lab would also be joining. Unfortunately, she can't join today due to a conflict, but she'll be represented by Amadou, the Accelerator Lab advisor for Africa. So I welcome both Robert and Amadou. Now, just before we get started, I wanted to offer some background on what these digital discovery sessions are designed to do. These are really designed to support our new mandate for digital transformation that was approved on the 17th of February by the UN Environmental Assembly. So this is the first time we've been given a major mandate to use digital technologies to accelerate action in climate change, in biodiversity, and in pollution. And these sessions are offered on a monthly basis, and they're really an opportunity for UNEP colleagues to come together with our partners and our collaborators to learn about a concrete application of digital transformation. And we aim to really provide this safe space for peer-to-peer learning to really inform, enable, and inspire your own digital transformation journeys. So in addition to that background, I also wanted just to take this opportunity to welcome a few new participants to the session. I understand there's a number of people on from the new Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, the new CODES Coalition that's been launched on the 31st of March. So I welcome all the members that are coming from CODES, and we really thank you for joining and engaging. Now, in terms of the format for today, we're going to break up this session into something like 4 20-minute segments. So we'll have sort of 20 minutes of Robert presenting, and then we'll follow that with 20 minutes of questions and answers, and then we'll have another session, and that's et cetera, et cetera. So we're hoping to roll this out over the next 1.5 hours, depending on how much engagement there is. So I would say, please feel free to actively engage, use the chat, share links, share ideas, share questions, and contribute as much as you can. Now, as I said, the session is being recorded, and we will post it on the Spark Blue Codes platform for further review and for those that couldn't attend today. So without further delay, let me hand over to Robert. Robert, the floor is yours. Welcome.
If I could get my computer off of mute. I think I got too many windows open, so I got some slow processing going on this morning. Maybe that's my brain, maybe it's the computer, I'm not sure. But thanks, David. It's great to be here with friends from UNEP and also across the coalition. So as David said, I am the Chief Digital Officer for UNDP, which is a newish position for the organization. It was created last year, and I was in 2019, and I joined UNDP in September 2019 in that role. Previously, I was at the World Food Programme, where I was leading the innovation division there. And so UNDP has been going through this digital journey, and in fact, it's a digital and innovation journey, and that's Amadou's going to talk about the innovation accelerator labs and things as well. So I'm going to give you a bit of a sense and overall of the kind of, it's going to be a little bit soup to nuts in a way. So we'll kind of go through and see where the questions are and so on. And if there's questions after, we're happy to try to answer those as well, and so on and so forth. I'm joined by a few UNDP colleagues. We've got here Nina Grinman. We've got Nalide Holbrugge from my team. Amadou's here, and probably a couple of others are joining as well, and they're going to help me with different parts of this presentation as we go through. So, David, we were just looking at the screen. Can you see the screen all right? Is it legible?
Perfect. Yeah, it's legible. Okay, I know you can't full screen it, but we can see it. It's pretty good.
Yeah, apologies for some reason not being able to put this on full screen. So we'll just go ahead this way. All right, so the first thing to say is probably, introduction to UNDP. I'm sure many of you, perhaps most of you on this call, are familiar with UNDP, but just in case you're not, UNDP, of course, is the human development arm of the United Nations. We are working in 170 countries with around 20,000 staff, and there is in UNDP quite a few different thematic teams. I mean, the mandate writ large is poverty eradication, but we have many programs across areas such as governance, the crisis prevention and resilience, gender programming, and of course, very relevant to UNEP, environment and renewable energy. So it's an organization that does a lot of things in a lot of places. And so that means that when we look at how do we transform to a digital environment, there's a lot of different things going on there that we have to take into account. Now, UNDP set out to create a digital strategy in 2019. The main sort of rallying vision around the digital strategy is that we recognize the need for UNDP to become much more familiar, let's say, equipped and relevant in this space. This is because the world, as we know, is changing. The context of development is changing. Digital and the emergence of new technologies is one of the factors driving that change. And so we are really trying to look at digital as not so much just a tool to do development work the way we always did it, but rather understanding how we do development in a digital era. And that's an important contextual shift to understand for the organization, because a lot of the innovation and digital work sometimes can focus on the very tactical level, but we want to be sure that we have a vision at a more strategic level. Digital is not new to UNDP by any stretch. There have been programs for the last 20, even close to 30 years on ICT for development and things. And we have some very strong examples of digital work in the organization. But the strategic plan that was brought in for 2018 to 2021 really emphasized the need to create the next generation of UNDP. And so really emphasized the innovation and digital architecture that would be necessary. And so the strategic plan was brought in, and some of the investments on the innovation side started to happen. And that's a lot of the work on the accelerator labs and things that Amadou will speak about in just a second. But in late 2018, early 2019, UNDP really set out to build this digital strategy, recognizing that it was one of the pillars of next gen UNDP. The digital strategy is really quite simple in its form. This is available online as well, and I can't quite remember the URL, but it's Digital Strategy UNDP. It brings it up right away. It's got two main pathways, and it's basically saying that the first pathway is that we must understand how we are reimagining the way that we provide services for our partners. And so that is about the way we deliver services, our collaboration modalities, even the way we do advocacy. The second pathway is around the internal parts of the organization. So how do we really get the organization fit for purpose to be able to be that digitally enabled partner for the governments and other partners who we work with? And so it's about how do we get our data working for us? How do we really get our internal systems and architecture really fit for purpose? Now, when I joined, and so the digital strategy doesn't set out a super specific or granular kind of roadmap as such. And that was really left to me when I joined the organization. And what we kind of worked on over the first few months that I was in UNDP is really trying to understand what would our main focus areas be within these things. And this diagram kind of represents the 4 or 5 main areas that we work in. The right-hand side is really more toward the internal systems. The left-hand side is more toward the programmatic. And I'll just kind of quickly describe each of them, and then later in the presentation we'll go through essentially what's in each of these areas. in a little bit more depth. On the internal side, it's really understanding what is the technology and data architecture that we need, what is our digital core as an organization that we need to be fit for purpose. Understanding, therefore, not only the core technology systems, but how we use our data, and what guides us when it comes to this internal core, this digital core. On the top right, the capacity building and networks, this is really about building the digital culture of the organization, finding the ways to really build this into our DNA as staff, but also some of the systems surrounding that. And again, I'll come back to each of these and explain a bit more. On the left-hand side, two areas around a more programmatic work, which is really understanding digital innovation and scaling. So UNDP, the way that we're organized, we are in, as I mentioned, a lot of places with country offices that are often very creative and entrepreneurial. The challenge there is that, and the accelerator labs are one of the main engines for that as well. The challenge, though, is in the digital space, we don't see a lot of scaling organically. So we need to build scaling pathways for innovations that are showing promise at a national level to either scale up to their full potential nationally or go to multiple countries. And then finally, on the bottom left, areas around new programs, capacities and expertise that we need, as well as country support. What we mean by this is there are entirely new areas of work that are emerging that the current setup of UNDP is not equipped to handle. So, for example, who in the organization works on smart cities? What about digital finance and what's happening there? And then, as I'll mention in a second, what about overall digital transformation support for government partners? And really, how do we get countries and the programs they're running supported so that they can quickly adapt and provide the services that governments are asking for? So those are the sort of four main work stream areas. And then in the center of this diagram, a little bit more around the thought leadership elements, sort of looking at the next horizon, running this as a transformation program, because this is a transformation effort. And then importantly, how do we bring in the broader ecosystem of private sector partners, of academic institutions, of civil society, and so on, people and organizations that can really bring in the expertise that isn't naturally in the organization. And so just kind of also to acknowledge that in that effort to build up the innovation and digital infrastructure of the organization, UNDP has a number of things that are happening in motion at the same time. So as the Chief Digital Officer, I have a transformation team that works globally, but we also have a global policy center in Singapore that has capacity to work in some of these digital areas, such as urban solutions and others. We have the global innovation team, which works on supporting partners in systemic innovation and taking a systems approach. We have the Accelerator Lab network, which is that kind of country-based network of enormous creativity that is really working as kind of little engines of creativity and innovation at the country level. We also have and are building out as part of our work the Digital Advocates, which is a network of essentially one champion in each country and each bureau for UNDP, and I'll come back to that in a second. So it's basically forming part of an overall mosaic, if you will, of innovation and digital infrastructure. Not all of it was built all at the same time, but it actually has all been built in complementary ways. Okay, so that's kind of just the little intro, and we thought that first we would actually turn to Amadou and the Accelerator Lab Lab network to go through a little bit on, what is these things called the Accelerator Labs, what do they do, etc. How are they set up? And then we can jump back into the digital strategy, those areas that I mentioned before, and then go through a little bit more detail, the rollout and how we foresee digital happening in the organization. So Amadou, I hope that you are there, and I will, if you just let me know when to advance the slides, I can do that for you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rob, and I think you already set the context and, bringing together the strategic vision on having different stream in terms of innovation, digital, and acceleration. So this is really complementary to what UNDP aim to achieve in terms of shaping development and also, Rob, you mentioned this transformation both internally and how we can impact the development from the outside of the organization. So Gina put together a few slides. I'm going to cover it, and yeah. So basically, this is really a deliberate way to see how network effect can bring change within and outside of the organization. And the Accelerator Labs actually has this promise to build the fastest and the largest network of learning. So basically, our work is really to leverage on learning through the integration of work happening in different countries. And as you can see on this map, we are covering actually 116 countries through 92 accelerator labs, where the majority of the lab, around 1/3, actually located in Africa. So yeah, please Rob, the next slide. So what do we bring to the development? So basically, we have this network that I was mentioning, 92 accelerator labs, 116 countries, working together on different development challenges. So what is interesting is really this direct improvisation. So meaning like we let the labs operate. They identified based on the context, based on interacting with their direct environment to try to focus on what is relevant to the context. And through that, we leverage on different methods or services here, going through collective intelligence. So looking at really where there is a need to focus, who we need to talk to, basically the people who are really affected by issues or causing the issues or influencing. So just to have a great insight in terms of what need to be addressed. Then we try to put together different experiments. So basically, as these challenges are very complex, we don't have clear answer. The idea is being able to test. And we are leveraging on experiment, but considering layering in terms of intervention. So it's like different parallel interventions and trying to see what works, what doesn't work. And this is how we are learning. Again, this we want here really from the insight that we are capturing to see how we can influence decision making and how we can bring different partners to work together. This is basically trying to diversify the partnership and also the type of and source of data that we are using to understand these challenges. And I think it's continuous scanning. Basically, I remember when we started the labs on 2019, we are talking to different countries, asking to them what are some of the development challenges or frontier challenges that they want to address. And 1 month after, the priority completely changed. This was the case when the Arab Spring hit. So how, for example, we can adapt to this kind of change quickly. And COVID was also one example where we see the role of the digital, for example, and how the labs help the country's offices to shift and being able to bring different solutions, connecting, for example, informal workers to the consumer. So we have this scanning and exploration function when we try. We cannot predict, but we can capture the small signal of change. And this is really how the lab is relevant. So the next slide, please.
En morgen dus aansluitend een gesprek met de arts.
So here you can see the network that we have. Basically, the 92 labs, 116 countries, and 276 peoples. And it's also interesting to see the kind of profile we have in this network. Basically, it's very new, but it's a way to have the right skills to face these challenges that we have. So we have profiles around solution mapping. So how we can really talk to the people on the ground to see what they are coping, the coping mechanism, what kind of solution they are developing from the ground, and that can be used to answer to the challenges. And we have exploration function, basically people who has data science capabilities, or understanding data and being able to here to combine data, people, and technology to leverage on these three components. And also we have people who can formulate hypotheses and test them. So, and in terms of context, we have small island developing state as well as least developed countries. So this is not like just going where it's easy, but it's tapping where we have the real challenges. And in the way we operate, we don't ask report, for example, to our labs. What we ask to them is to reflect. So on weekly basis, to reflect on what they have been doing, what they learn, and on monthly basis to publish a blog. So this can be, for example, a pitch blog highlighting some of the experiment, or think of piece to go deeper in to address some of these critical areas, or it can be reflection blogs. And so far we have more than 400 blogs that has been published and currently available on our website. So as I mentioned also, the idea is really to bring new kind of partnership, to establish partnership around data, around technology, and diversify the type of solution. Based on the work that we are doing on the ground with our solution mapper, actually we have a database of more than 1,200 local solutions, so mapped in different countries. And we are here, we have some taxonomies emerging through these solutions that are captured. And we can have different use of these kind of solutions and data. And on my side, actually, we are exploring with the South-South cooperation how local solutions can be really an asset to foster that cooperation through, for example, matchmaking and knowledge sharing. So I think that's all for the moment. But yes, happy to take questions around our approach, and also how we are using some of the innovations method to tackle these challenges. Over. Thanks.
Thanks very much.
David, sorry, Dave, just want to jump in and say, so if it's convenient now to stop and take a couple questions specific to innovation labs, or accelerator labs, we can do that. Otherwise, your guidance in terms of whether we proceed. I see a question from Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. Let's take a break. Let's have some questions. And I think Jeff has a burning question that I also share. So Jeff, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, okay. Very interesting, Amadou. Enjoyed it. An obvious question, however, given the number of countries you're engaged with and the massive scale of the problem and the large but limited group of experts you've got available, then do you have processes and criteria to determine precisely what your impact is, to measure whether your level of impact? Are you having the influence you'd like to have? It's the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. We have our results framework. And basically, this is, I think, a new way also to measure innovation. I mean, from the beginning, failure, for example, was something that we agree on. The most important here is really what we learn. But basically, we try to see how we influence, for example, policy and decision making. And we try to see the number of partnership, unusual partnership that we are creating and developing. The new source of data that we are using, for example, to analyze the issues that we have. And also in terms of process, how we are changing the way that people reflect on do innovation, even internally. For example, we have seen how our labs are trying the country offices to develop their new country program document. So I just share the link to our annual report where we try to highlight some of these case studies where we are working concretely on the different challenges. But basically, we are measuring at different level, including the tools, the process, but as well, I mean, how we are influencing the decision making, for example, helping to develop innovation policies, and also, you know, all these solutions and new source of data and partnership that we are creating. I don't know if that's answer to your
Thanks,
question.
Amadou. I think Jeff can have a look at the impact report, the annual report, and come back to you directly bilaterally if he has more questions. I think the next question is from Brennan. Brennan Van Dyke, do you want to take the floor?
Thanks. Yeah. Really interesting. Thank you so much for bringing this information to us. I have so many questions, but I'll just start with, do you have specific criteria, methodologies that you use for identifying, for seeking solutions, or identifying those solutions that you think will work, that you make sure that they don't have unintended consequences across the different pillars of sustainable development, for example, that, you know, ways to determine if they would work in one culture or another, in large and small scale users, you know, all that kind of stuff. Did you come up with methodologies for doing this that you use over and again, or and criteria for identifying? And then once you identify solutions, does UNDP formally endorse them, promote them to its to the governments and partners, to the financial community, etc.?
Thanks, Brennan. Great question. Amadou or Rob?
Thank you. You know, we have our solution mappers in each of these countries. Basically, they have ethnographic profile where they can talk to the communities. And the way that we use solution mapping in terms of process, we can see two things. So basically, you can decide to do your solution mapping in a very open way. So basically, you don't have focus area, for example, climate or security or energy. So you just explore, then through what you are collecting, you will see emerging some patterns. And the aim here is having solution, but also through that to identify the needs. And this is important because the solution can tell you where to focus. And this is where people are looking something. So we have this approach, but in the meantime, when we talk about, for example, scaling, we are more thinking about growth. So basically, it's, for example, how we can build partnership with some of these grassroots innovators to help them either to develop their product or to amplify it or to make it now. One of the partnership that we have just posted is with UNDP and Hyundai Motors and Sidley, a Canadian-based organization. The platform is called For Tomorrow, where we try to capture some of these solutions to make them visible, and now building an ecosystem behind these solutions in terms of matchmaking, in terms of amplification, in terms of looking at for financing. And of course, we are aware about critical issues on the IP, for example, and the no harm principles. And this is also bringing some reflection internally on how we can position the organization on this topic, and also how to find clear answer where there is no, and it's just sometimes exploratory. And I mentioned at the beginning that we are exploring, for example, how local solutions can be a driver or enablers to sustain South-South cooperation. Over.
Thanks. We'll take one more question and then we'll go back into the presentation. I'm going to ask if Andy Middleton can take the floor. Andy, if you're speaking right now, we cannot hear you. If you are away from your computer.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you now, yes.
Great.
Go ahead, please, Andy.
Great. So picking up on the excellent ideas you both presented, I'm really aware of the need for hyper speed in terms of deploying this at scale across countries. And I'm just wondering, to what extent have you been able to engage education systems at a country level so that every child in every school starts to play with the data that you're developing to solve sustainability challenges in a place-based context around where they live? Food, energy, poverty, based on data, with a place to put those ideas out to be copied and learned.
Awesome question, Andy. Thank you.
Yes, so I think we are trying, and as you can see, the lab itself is really a big experiment. So, I mean, even recruiting, 276 people through more than 8,000 applicants is itself, very challenging, and we did it quite in a very innovative way on using some recruitment software like VidCruiter, but also leveraging on the network and having more people to help on that. And diversifying partnership for us is really a key. So when our labs are in place, the first thing that they do within the country office, because this is not also something that operates separately, it's embedded within the country office under the responsibility of our RRs. So they already benefit for that environment, and they are all locals from the country where they have been recruited. And from there, they start kind of ecosystem mapping and stakeholder mapping. And this is help to develop the network. And they partner basically with local institutions based on the challenges that they are working on. And at global level also, we have partnership with different institutions that are helping us in terms of, digging into some of the areas that we are focusing in terms of learning. And yes, we have examples that I can share through the work that we did with the European Investment Bank on the COVID. The report is available, and where you will see different institutions coming as partner with the labs, and also local startups helping them to achieve and to deliver their work.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that's a question that we'll actually love to hear more about in a follow-up discussion, is specifically embedding some of this in the educational environment and how that kind of educational ecosystem connects to the accelerator lab. Maybe we can follow that up with after the session, but I actually do want to open the floor for one more question, because it's a question that I think a lot of individuals in the UN setting might be interested in. So I want to ask if Pooja, would you mind only asking the last question you posted around bureaucracy? Please, Pooja, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. Very quickly, I have a bunch of questions as well, but I'll limit it to the one that David mentioned. You speak about the Hyundai partnership. In an agile sort of disrupt or to get disrupted world, we need to move fast. I think it's difficult as an UN organization just dealing with a number of, the bureaucratic process involved in partnerships. How do you circumvent that and more quickly mobilize partnerships such as these? I think that's a key challenge that we have, and would love to hear your tips. Thank you.
And I think the word is not circumvent, I think it's accelerate. So Amadou, please, how do you accelerate bureaucracy with digital tools and tech?
I think there are a different way. The partnership is one part, but how, for example, to shorten the programming cycle, as we always know, where you, for example, needs more time to develop, to design project document, and the implementation take time, and the learning. So this is really where the lab is changing. For example, we are just using a short programming cycles on working on challenges ranging from, for example, 3 months to 6 months. And in terms of partnership, it's happening at the country level where our labs work, but also we have this great support from the headquarter level. And there is a strong willingness here to diversify this the partnership, we have colleagues who support that. Basically, Reina, who is our expert on that, and trying really to help us to navigate through the operational challenges that I acknowledge. But in the meantime, we are learning and taking some of these challenges internally, and to see how this work. But regarding the partnership with Hyundai, we had a third party called Sidley was bringing also the two sides together, and I think there is a common interest here. For example, where we are working on one SDG, this is the SDG 11, if I remember correctly, on sustainable cities. But if there is the awareness, I think it's happened. And in terms of suggestion, we are also looking at how to develop new type of collaboration modes that are not actually there. Currently, for example, beyond the MOUs or beyond the procurement process, can we have other modalities? And this reflection also is ongoing within UNDP. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Amadou. And again, I think we'll take that one offline as well. Once you have those modalities in place, we'd love to copy them if they're working. So why don't we continue, go back to the presentation. Let's go back to Robert. You had a list, I believe, of different segments. If you want to take over and hand off to the next presenter, that would be great. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I was just watching the flood of questions come in. So David, I realize we're going to have to balance the presentation part with the question and discussion part. So I'll try to move quickly through some of the presentation, and Amadou and others will do their best to answer the questions in the chat as they come in. Just to the last question from Pooja, both in UNDP and then when I worked in WFP as head of innovation, this issue comes up a lot. And there's no good answer for it in the UN system. Nobody has found the silver bullet yet on how to do partnerships seamlessly, because there's always tricky parts and hassles related to bureaucratic hurdles and all of the rest of it. However, I do see that things are starting to shift a little bit, both on the part of the UN as well as the part of the potential partners. There's always a sticking point around the sort of legal arbitration in contracts that you come up with. There's always sticking points around some of the other elements, and we're learning now how to get better at communicating about that. The internal mindset is another issue, and we will talk about it a little bit going forward on here, but it's about how do we change our notion of risk management, and our colleagues who work in functions like procurement, HR, finance, etc., and getting them to enable innovation is very difficult when every incentive they have is to eliminate risk rather than manage risk. And so there's a whole kind of internal education and cultural process that needs to happen there. But anyway, I'm happy to somehow discuss that later as well. But let me move on and sort of let's just go back to digital. So the accelerator labs are part of that innovation structure, and the accelerator labs are not strictly part of the digital transformation, but they form part of that overall mosaic I mentioned, which is that we want to equip ourselves for next gen UNDP. And the accelerator labs, by their nature, often come with digital solutions, but we need to make sure that the entire organization is able to adapt and evolve according to the needs presented by the opportunities and challenges from digital. Just to kind of go back to the digital strategy and the implementation process. So after the strategy came into play, I joined the organization. We started up the transformation team, which is based in the Office of the Administrator. We created these sort of 4 work streams, and then COVID hit. And so a lot of the digital transformation story of UNDP is actually intertwined with the COVID pandemic as well. And what happened was that we saw a very strong acceleration, particularly on the programmatic side, but actually across all fronts as well in the organization. In COVID, or in response to COVID, we started seeing many digital solutions that were being brought to bear, many of them emerging from the Accelerator Lab network. In total, we have tracked over 250 of them. I think it's about 257, just coming from UNDP country offices alone. And when we started to look and dig into what those responses were, we saw a range of things in the digital space programmatically, from providing laptops to civil servants so they could work from home, or video conferencing facilities, all the way through to e-commerce platforms, digital communication platforms for socially distanced populations, e-government services going online, and then all the way to the sort of policy and regulatory space of how to use new technologies and requests from governments on how to do and implement digital strategies overall. And so one of the pieces that my team put in place early on and in the midst of COVID was the ability to provide support to our country offices on working in the digital space. And so part of this gets at Pooja's question as well about, how do you get around some of the bureaucratic hurdles? Well, a lot of it is actually aggregating best practice and trying to make sure that you've got kind of a responsive support function in some of this. So we put the capacity in place in my team to provide basic advisory support, creating a list of rosters or a roster list of experts, individual experts. We created 10 new roster profiles in UNDP. That means that they can be called down very quickly to be applied in certain areas. Building up overall partnerships with private sector, academia, vendors, and others. Knowledge sharing, which is really key to getting the different experiences across the organization share in a shareable way, and then scaling support, which I'll come back to in a second. And another piece that I've kind of already foreshadowed is that in the programming side, we see a lot of requests for support on very tactical type projects, and those are fine. I mean, we absolutely want to continue to equip the organization to work in those kind of project-specific responses. But we also see this shift, a shift from the tactical project type response to a more strategic and holistic approach to digital in countries, in ministries, with our partners in general. And so one of the things as a result of the COVID acceleration and, sort of looking at what this is telling us about the digital divide, the need for overall digital capacities in countries, is we have built a framework for whole of society digital transformation. Really what this is not a blueprint. This is not like a specific or granular roadmap on getting to A to Z. It is really a reference model that says, if you're going to start to think about digital in one part of your country or your economy or ministry, you need to consider that there are adjacencies that are important for you to consider. So, for example, what's the point of talking about turning yourselves into a knowledge economy if the physical infrastructure isn't there? Or similarly, how are you going to actually encourage sustainable digital transformation in a country without a thriving startup ecosystem to drive the innovation around that? And so really trying to understand what are the adjacencies that are important. And if, okay, I took it out of the presentation, but if we go down one level from this, you would see that there's sort of detail in each one of these boxes. What we're trying to create is the sort of navigator so that we understand how the adjacencies actually work and how we can support countries to better effect. One very important piece of this that I want to draw attention to is the sort of lighter blue box toward the top called Principles for Digital Inclusion. And when UNDP programmatically looks at what is our value proposition in working in the digital space, we need to be clear about what we're bringing to the table as opposed to McKinsey or some other private sector firm. And that is the fact that we are not a tech company and we are not a management consulting firm, but we are a human development organization. And so our role in advising governments on whole of society digital transformation must be rooted in the idea that digital must be inclusive and we must be intentionally inclusive. Another lesson we learned from COVID, in addition to the importance of the digital divide, is also around how do we apply digital quickly in a society, but to do it in a way that doesn't actually aggravate inequality or other social exclusions. Because you can see situations where if you move all of your services quickly online, you will be leaving out not only those who are not connected, but those who are excluded or marginalized for other reasons, elderly and so on. And so we really want to put inclusion at the center of our digital work at a holistic level. Now, we built a tool that can help us do this. So we have a digital readiness tool that is a kind of a quick to use interface where there's an online sort of set of questions and surveys for different sectors of a society. There's then ready-made or public data sets that are in the back end of the system. And when we combine those two pieces of information, we can come out with a sort of dashboard of a particular country, where they are in digital, and from a very high level point of view and perception point of view, and then understand how do we take that discussion forward. So this is a key to where UNDP, again, where do we see our value add? Our value add is not going to be in responding to every single digital request everywhere, but it might be helping governments with that intentional inclusive look understand how they might proceed with their digital transformation and then linking in other partners across the ecosystem to support that effort. And what that means is that overall in the organization, we see a couple of these kind of overarching service offers, the digital transformation strategy support stuff. There is a few others in there about how do we build capacity across societies, how do we leverage digital public goods, ethics and technology, because we know that there are risks and challenges related to technology, including misinformation pieces and so on. And then in the organization where we have our sort of more traditional thematic teams, we're also working to enable them with digital offerings. So we're working together with the health team on how do we really build the digital component of that. And in just a little while, we're going to be joined by Reina Otsuka from our Nature, Climate and Energy team. And it's the same issue. How can we partner with them to build digital capacity in those traditional thematic areas so we as an organization can offer that? Now, we also, just to kind of move then from the space of country support and the kind of broader holistic programming into the digital innovation acceleration. So there were a couple questions about scale and things, and Amadou talked about the accelerator labs and what they do. So I mentioned before, we see a lot of creativity coming out of UNDP country offices, accelerator labs and other countries alike. But to be able to take innovations and scale them to multiple countries, and particularly in the digital space, when it could make sense to build global solutions that can be offered in multiple places, we built an accelerator process in the organization. We've just launched our first full cohort. We tested with sort of an MVP model last year. We went out for call for proposals at the end of last year, and then we've launched the first cohort of 10 projects now. And the idea is that these are all projects that have proven ideas at a country level, where we can come in with support in terms of funding, some mentoring and coaching, networking connections, and giving them profile to be able to build those into multi-country scaling innovations. And what that looks like is basically, at the moment, it's a virtual accelerator, and we will follow these 10 projects with direct support over the next few months. Each of them are getting a first tranche of about $50,000. That can scale up a little bit depending on the promise of the project, and we won't just automatically give funding because you have to kind of prove that you're making progress, if you will. But it involves, one-to-one mentoring. It involves joint learning, and then eventually there will be a kind of a graduation point for the innovations, and then we'll be looking for how to take the next step beyond. Okay, here are projects they're ready for scale. Then we need to find the right resource mix and country mix to really put them across multiple places. Okay, David, I think I'm just kind of knowing that we're a little bit behind schedule. Maybe I can just jump in and do some of the kind of more internal side of the digital transformation as well. Or would you prefer we stop for questions on the kind of programmatic side?
Well, let's stop for one question, which is my question.
Okay.
And maybe you're going to touch on this afterwards. I'm very curious about kind of internal incentives. You talked about the fact that there are 18,000 people. So what incentives and kind of KPIs have you put forward to really encourage people to lean in? And then how are you measuring digital transformation across such a massive organization? Are you able to measure it at an organizational level? And if so, how?
Right. So I will get into a little bit of the sort of mechanisms that we're using. But in terms of like a high level answer to the question, one of the most important incentives is having the steadfast commitment of our leadership to constantly send the signal about what's important in the organization. So Akim is 100% behind this. And he makes it very clear that not only is it his expectation that the organization really engages in and supports digital and innovation for that matter, but also that he announced to the executive board that we are either going digital and doing this, or we're going out of business, because the burning platform for us is that clear, particularly in the light of COVID. There is no way we can pretend that digital transformation of UNDP is not absolutely critical, because it is critical for our partners. How can we possibly support our partners if we're not, doing the same transformation ourselves? But I forgot the second part of your question, David. Do
you have specific internal incentives? In other words, do you offer like funding top-ups? Do you have project approval criteria?
Right.
What are the internal mechanisms, incentives you have, KPIs?
Okay, so well, one of them is that in that process that I just mentioned of digital innovation, so kind of creating interest and giving a pathway for potential innovations to be supported. So there's kind of a monetary incentive there as well as a profile. But in terms of programmatic requirements, I'm going to get into that right away. So if I maybe just proceed. One of the pieces that we've put into place in the organization is called digital by default, and it's a kind of it's exactly getting at what you were asking, David. It's like saying that digital by default means that prior to designing your program, or as you design your program, any program in the organization, you must answer a set of questions about how you are using digital. And in other words, do you have a digital output? What are the digital strategies you're using? And if you do not have a digital component, you actually have to provide an explanation why. And this has been put into our the sort of template design, the quality assurance process. It's going to be put into our integrated work planning process, and it will be layered into the next strategic plan so that it goes all the way down from the indicators, the indicator framework to the individual project level. And that is something that I think we're the first in the UN system to do it, but we're not the first globally, because, for example, GIZ has a similar system. DFID did something similar a number of years ago. And USAID's new digital strategy talks about something similar, also digital by default. So it's a hard-coded way that we will, one, encourage people to think actively about digital first, and two, be much better able to track what's going on out there and therefore be able to understand needs and support. Because at the moment, the digital stuff is happening, but it doesn't tend to be tracked in any of our reporting systems. So that's a challenge. And so I mentioned digital. So the sort of the package here of incentives and cultural support, digital by default, I already mentioned. The digital advocates or digital champions network, I already mentioned, but this is a sort of a, we've appointed one digital champion for each country office, as well as each headquarters unit. They will be run basically like a community of practice, but the idea there is that they serve as the sort of two-way antenna, broadcasting what's going on in the digital strategy, but also sending in messages about what are the needs at the country level, what's happening. And those people will be people who know exactly where to find support in the organization as well. So they're frontline kind of triage and support, and then referencing as well. And then we're going to continue to make trainings available organization-wide. The digital champions will receive specialized training, but we'll make others available. So we already did this last year. We've had about 3,000 people in the workforce trained on digital awareness. But that's going to expand this year because we have a new data strategy as well, and it's going to be including digital literacy, data literacy, and a number of other topics will be made available. So there's not a hard incentive around that. We're not forcing people yet to do it as mandatory training, although that's in the discussion. But we're making available some of those resources. Now, I think that my colleague Nina actually had to go to another meeting in this period because we ran a bit behind. One of the interesting kind of internal platforms that we put into place that's supporting a lot of the kind of exchanges that we have, and including some of the stuff we've done on the coalition recently, David, is, and this is really just one example of an early digital project that we created after the digital strategy was put in place. It's the Spark Blue platform, and really the sort of what is our next generation of encouraging digital collaboration. And so it is a collaborative platform that makes it possible to create essentially different discussion groups or dialogue platforms. You can have event focus and supporting of physical or virtual events, but you can have this kind of ongoing dialogue that's moderated. This is a platform that's made available for service outside of the organization. In other words, to support member states and others if they're running large consultation processes, but also works internally. For example, I mentioned the Digital Champions Network. That has its own space on Spark Blue. We have been creating new strategies. We just built a data strategy. We ran consultations for the strategy on Spark Blue, and so on and so forth. So this was one of the kind of early demonstration projects that we ran in the digital strategy to demonstrate to the organization that we can do things in a different way. Okay, I'm going to, I don't think I'll get too much into this, David. We can talk about it later, but as you know, we're leveraging Spark Blue to support the digital, the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability, which is, I think, already proving to be a very active community of interested people. Okay, David, the final piece on this is for the kind of digital transformation piece is the data strategy and the data futures platform. And then Reina will be here to talk about the nature, climate, and energy piece. Should I go straight on to that, do you think?
Yeah, please go ahead, Rob.
Okay.
I know you have a hard stop in 25 minutes, right?
Actually, I've managed to clear that, so I'm okay. But I don't know where everyone else is. I managed to get rid of that problem.
Okay, great. I mean, normally I think people are ready to stay on for 2 hours, so we can extend it beyond the. Okay, great. So please go ahead.
Okay, so some of you may be asking, okay, so what about the internal guts of the organization? You know, how are we changing the kind of the digital core? And one of the first things we did is, I do not oversee the corporate IT function. That sits within our Management Services Bureau, but I have a very close and strong relationship with them. And one of the first things that we decided to do together was to create an IT strategy for the organization, because we felt that that was a necessary building block. And for us, the IT environment was quite outdated. And so the new IT strategy essentially brings in a replacement for the ERP system. So we're revamping the whole ERP, putting in place new customer relationship management platforms, putting in place all sorts of new collaboration platforms and things. There's basically 7 areas that it works around to support both the digital core as well as the sort of collaboration tools like Zoom and Teams and so on and so forth. Getting our kind of decision-making support tools in place and all of that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go into detail more than that. I'm happy to if there's questions, but we built this IT strategy to really start to work on the digital core, and that's largely being driven by our corporate IT function. But when it came to looking at the data work and the data side of the internal strategy, this crosses the programmatic area, the management operational area, and it's critical to a digital transformation process that we get our data in order. And the challenge for us was that we were quite fragmented on the data space. So we had 6,000 dashboards in the organization that had been built up over time. The dashboards themselves are not the problem. The problem is that most of those were being fed from fragmented data silos. And so that's the real problem, that you can't get your data integrated in one place. So we saw that there was a real opportunity here to build a data strategy for the organization so that we can really start to leverage data as the strategic asset that it is. We started that process by creating data principles that would guide the creation of the strategy. The UN Secretariat last year also produced their own data strategy with data principles. And so a lot of the work that we did was inspired by that, and we kind of fall under the umbrella of that. But we needed to make sure that we were building our own principles that were internalized by the organization. And so built in here are, for example, it's no surprise or accident that safeguarding personal data is actually the first principle on the list. We need to be sure that we are dealing or stewarding people's personal data with all the appropriate safeguards and so on. Importantly, the fourth one down, making data open by default. The days of data hoarding must end if we are going to really use data strategically. So I won't go through all of these, but the point is we came up with these principles, as I said, inspired by the UN Secretariat's data strategy. Then we approved these with our executive group first to make sure we were solid on the principles, and then we went on to build the data strategy. The data strategy itself really covers 3 big areas: governance, which is sort of the rules and processes around data; people, the data literacy and capacity of the organization; and technology, which is the digital core. Now, the technology piece is largely, in a sense, covered by a combination of the IT strategy and some back-end internal architecture work that we've done since then. The people is, around kind of getting those trainings offered and available to people, and starting to make a kind of data networks available in the organization. The governance side is where, frankly, we have to do a lot of work, because there really isn't much now in the governance area of data in the organization. So we don't have a common data taxonomy. We don't have many data policies on how to treat personally identifiable information, so on and so forth. So what we've done is we've created a data governance group that's part of that blue pillar. I am chairing that temporarily as the sort of data champion in the organization. It includes membership from all the different bureaus of the organization, and it is the place where we will decide on what are our guide rails as an organization, what are the internal rules that we follow when it comes to data. And that's really important that we get that in order. Now, I just wanted to touch on our data futures platform quickly. What happened was we were starting to build the data strategy, but COVID kind of intervened, and we needed to do some data work really quickly to respond to COVID. So we very quickly created a data platform that could support our work on COVID-19 response. And really, it would be a place where we can bring the best of class data on socioeconomic recovery from COVID. We can start to provide real insights. This is not a data hub. It's really more about driving insights into what we're seeing. And then we've got the issue of how can we support the rest of the system or other organizations, et cetera, country level, regional level, or global level in terms of responses to COVID. So what we built was the COVID-19 Data Futures platform. That is available at data.undp.org. It built on a lot of the existing silos that were there, but because we had and this is sort of a change management issue, because we had a crisis facing us, it allowed us to bring together the different players in a much more expedient way than what may have otherwise been the case. And so a lot of the kind of data silo holders that were in the organization previously were forced to work together. We brought, well, not forced, but we brought them together under the kind of that crisis heading, and we're able to really create a consolidated platform. And now that has been underpinned by a common data architecture in the back end that becomes the new place where anybody with data sets in UNDP should be using that back end platform. And then we start to be able to build a number of front end applications on it. Now, that's sort of, I think given time, I do have my colleague Naledi that's here. She would be able to walk through a little demo if we wanted that, David, but I don't know if maybe it's best if we take some questions first, because then the next up would be Reina talking about our nature, climate, and energy work as a sort of a thematic deep dive on digital.
Thanks very much, Rob. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm looking for hands up or anybody in the chat that wants to ask a question to Rob. Maybe Annette Hester, do you want to come in on any questions that are brewing in your mind?
Hi. I was, I mean, it's quite fascinating, all the different elements that you have. It's very complex and works at many levels. When you're, I was reflecting on your governance structure, trying to, in my experience, is trying to impose governance from top down is really almost impossible. What are the parallel systems that you are envisioning so that you can work from top down and bottom up? So maybe they shall meet at some point. So do you have a strategy that goes the other way as well?
Yeah. Shall I answer that, David?
Yeah, please
now?
go ahead.
No, a great question. And so, yes, there are, for basically each one of these areas, there's a kind of a top-down and a bottom-up. And one of the things that we're helped by is the fact that there's a very strong demand for digital from bottom up as well. So this is not just the top of the organization telling, us a whole lot of unwilling people, because our countries are being faced with these digital challenges every single day. And so our countries are saying, we need help, we need support, we need the capacity, and so on. And so the tricky part, as usual in a change management process, actually sits in the middle, where you have a number of, let's say, bureaucratic levels of people very comfortable with the way things are. They're not feeling the heat from the field level, and they're sort of distanced from the top level. So they're kind of just sitting there in the comfort zone. And that's really difficult to penetrate. But to give an example, and I'm not sure if you were talking more about the programmatic side or the kind of data governance and other, but they're virtually the same. So for example, the digital by default shift to programming, I thought that we'd get a lot of resistance in the organization from this. But when we sort of tested the idea with a number of focus groups in our countries, they were saying, this is great, just make sure we have the capacity to support us doing that. In the case of data governance, so we've just started this process. The policy was approved about a month ago, or sorry, the strategy was approved about a month ago. We're launching the data governance group next week, or in a couple weeks' time. And I expect that when we start to talk about how do we put these sort of policies in place, we are going to face some resistance of people who kind of like the way things are. But I think COVID has also taught us that if we can bring things together, we're actually more powerful working together with bringing data together in a more integrated and usable way for a wider number of people is actually a much more effective way to get there. So, and I do agree that we have a lot of complexity in this. And part of it is that in our transformation process, we really decided that we could not afford to sequentially tackle these things. So some people would say, well, you guys are fools to try to change your programming if you're not changing your internal core, like first. But we just didn't have the luxury of that.
Yeah, no, I see a lot of other people wanting to ask questions, so I'll just be really brief, and we can take that up in a separate conversation. And I agree with you, and I completely agree that doing everything at the same time is the only way to go, because you can't stop the boat and like get off and get everything to do sequentially. It doesn't work that way. But the difference with the data governance is that most of the time this is work that people don't see immediate benefits. So people are always willing to do things, and they want a result, and they want to have something that they hold as a result of having put all that work. But data governance is not one of those things. So you end up with people disillusioned, sort of, and then they don't put the effort. So that's what becomes digital. You see it right away. But data governance is a different beast. So we can take up in different, if you're just starting the process. I've done a few of those and learned the hard way in several.
Thanks very much, Annette. And Robert, Annette was the host of the last digital discovery session we did on data visualization in the Canadian Energy Regulator. So some great experience there.
Yeah, but also, Robert, I know Gina quite well, so I'll connect with Gina on that.
Thanks very much, Annette. The next question is by Rafael Peralta. Please, the floor is yours.
Hi, Robert. This is Rafael Peralta, the Chief of Staff in UNEP. And, it's fascinating to listen to you because, in a sense, I think you're a little bit far ahead than we are in UNEP. And thanks to David and many others, I think we're making a slow progress. And I sincerely hope that next year we're going to see hopefully the beginning of a quantum leap I have to say, you've answered some of my questions through what Annette was mentioning. I was particularly curious about the digital by default element and how you handle that mid-level element that is always the hardest in a change management project. So perhaps then I would move to my second question, which was about your member states, because you've mentioned very much the whole point about the digital divide. And one thing that we're already seeing with our membership is that while there's great support on the side of our main donors, there is an undertone of doubt on the side of developing countries. You know, how are we going to lose out of this? And particularly given the normative mandate that UNEP has. So is there a risk that as we move into a bigger role on digital, on the normative front, that we're going to be benefiting more countries, developing countries? So how did it go with your board? How did you handle developing country concerns? Thank you.
No, it's a good question. And honestly, in this one, we saw a major shift as a result of COVID. I had the statistics somewhere, but I watched in our executive board meetings as we started, we moved the executive board into the virtual setting. And so everyone was already kind of thinking this is a new modality of doing things. But there were, I think in one board, we had 60% of board interventions following in the first session, when Akim gives his sort of opening remarks and things. And then a lot of the delegations respond. 60% of them mentioned the importance of digital. And that was not predominantly even necessarily in the donor countries. So I've actually seen or what we're hearing, and this may be a ministry issue as well that you deal with, but what we hear from our countries is that there is a strong demand. And I've actually not encountered anybody in the board who is actively against. I think there are some that are neutral because they don't understand it. They're not quite sure what this means. But in the light of the COVID pandemic, I really see that governments are now thinking much more seriously about what their digital strategy must be. Now, like I said, there may be ministries within governments that are more difficult to convince, but in some ways, I think it's our so, for example, I just gave an informal consultation maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. We had an informal consultation on not just what's happening in digital now, but what we think will happen in the next strategic plan period. And really, from G77 countries, we heard nothing but support. And in some cases, they were asking for more. How can you do more on cybersecurity? How can you do more for us on data privacy issues and things like that? So it's not a great answer for your question, Raphael, because we may have had it a little easier somehow, but I do think COVID has changed the mentalities, certainly of some parts of government.
Thanks, Robert. I'm gonna take moderator's prerogative to ask one more question, and it's about the data platform. As you say, you had 8,000 different dashboards. We don't have 8,000, but we're more in the hundreds. In terms of data platforms. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us how the heck did you federate that into so what was the federation strategy? And then how does the management structure work in terms of back end, data core, and front end? In such a big organization, how do you manage that?
I can tell you our story so far, but I don't know if it's replicable. So that's the tricky part. So early on in the COVID response, when UNDP was designated technical lead for socioeconomic recovery in the UN system, there were a number of mechanisms, kind of like crisis response mechanisms, that were put into place in the organization that started drawing people together to say, okay, how are we actually responding to COVID? And in the midst of one of those, a couple of colleagues and I started really pushing hard for a data response, and very quickly the senior leadership picked up on that and said, okay, well, what would that look like? And the idea was, well, how can we actually bring together UNDP data with publicly available data and make it something that can really provide value? And we wouldn't be able to do that unless we have some integration of all the different pieces that are going on now. And so we created kind of like a crisis response team. And what we did is, in my role as the Chief Digital Officer angle, we partnered with a part of our policy and program area. In fact, Reina, who's on the call, was in that area and leading on the data platform. We basically said, we're going to start with a minimum viable product, and we promised senior leadership that we would deliver them something within 4 weeks that would show the promise of the future promise of data in the organization. And we managed to actually deliver that by, well, a lot of hard work from Reina and other colleagues, but to then show that if we can, and at that point, the data silos hadn't been integrated. We just faked it. You had to pull strands from different silos and put them together. But we showed senior leadership that how compelling it could be, and then it created an appetite to do more. And so our colleagues in the different parts of the organization started to not just, they weren't really resisting, they were seeing, okay, how can we support this? And now the integrated backend that we're building, and it's almost like it's already built basically, but the integrated backend now becomes the one reference point for the place where people can go to either find the data or link to the data to be able to build then their own products. Because the people do want to do, like as was said before, people do want to do their own thing. And so the important thing is giving them a capacity that actually makes life easier to do their own thing on, building on an integrated or coherent base, as opposed to inventing a new silo. And so we're really trying to play with that space of getting something good enough that they will want to use it. So that's our story. And I honestly don't think we would have been as successful at this if we hadn't had COVID driving us to that crisis mentality.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Why don't we continue with the schedule, with the next presentation, and then we'll have a final round of questions afterwards. Thanks again.
Okay, so we're going to move to an example of one of the thematic teams, Nature, Climate, and Energy, which we thought would be interesting to UNEP. Reina, are you online?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I'll start, and just to give colleagues a context here. So I'm a digital innovation specialist stationed in the Nature, Climate, and Energy team, which is a part of the programmatic side of the organization, which Rob was mentioning. It's called the Global Policy Network and Bureau of Policy and Program Support. So the Nature, Climate, and Energy team is actually kind of the counterpart to UNEP for the enhanced partnership framework that we have in place. And another context is that green recovery and data is one of the work streams that we're working very closely with UNEP colleagues, including David and Alex and some others like Stephen Stone. And so a few of these are, for example, to have interoperability between the Data Futures platform and the World Environment Situation Room. There's also a conversation on the green recovery data analytics, which we're working very closely with the PAGE colleagues. There's also the CODIS that has been mentioned, and also ECLAB, how can we also work together around accelerator labs? These are the 4 streams that we're trying to work together. So we already have an ongoing partnership, and I'm very excited to be here today. So this is a strategy, and I think our case is really like a case study of what Rob has been saying as a strategy, what actually plays out in reality. It would be what I can share. And this is the strategy that we have specifically for the Nature, Climate, and Energy team. And you can see that we're trying to follow the digital strategy at the UNDP corporate level, where there's the partner experience, external facing sides on the left hand, and then there's the internal process on the right hand side. And as you have seen, it's really a messy process where we have to push both sides at once. We hope we could clean up our house first, but it didn't happen. We just had to go back and forth in a very rapid cycle. And for this year, you can see that on the right-hand side, we do have a strong project cycle management system that has been in operation for 3 years already. So that's kind of a strong backbone that we already had. And then we wanted to start applying different machine learning and AI to these project data, as well as on the left-hand side, we wanted to start to really go out and actually help the governments on technology application. And then there were a few big ticket innovation projects that we started off last year, which I'll try to talk about in the following slides. So we do have a small data/digital team in-house and working very closely with Rob's team in the executive office, the CDO office. And basically the CDO office calls me as a liaison, or they call me auntie to show where we're at. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the first project out of the 3 flagship projects, the first one was this business intelligence. And basically, you know, the Nature, Climate, and Energy team has a very strong vertical funded portfolio. So from the GEF and the GCF, we do have a $5 billion portfolio already, implementing on the ground or in the pipeline. And so we wanted to, first of all, make use of all of the data that is coming in from these projects, namely the household survey data, as well as, if possible, GIS data or any other basically data that's generated on the ground. And this project actually started last February, so it's 1 year ago, I guess. And then if you can please click to the next slide, Rob. So it was basically supposed to build up a data pipeline so that we can start to pull in all of the data together in one place and make sure that we clean it and transform it so that the data can be used by different projects for future, programming work, or even to apply machine learning if possible to start to analyze and predict different patterns based on this possible big data that we have. And just to note how messy it is, this project started last February, and then actually the project team that started on this was pulled in to actually build the data futures platform because of the COVID context. So the same people just basically was shifted, including myself, to really lead and start up the MVP and the data futures platform, and that became institutionalized. And so now, like, the Nature team is now going back to Nature, and we're trying to rebuild this thing specifically for the Nature thematic area. And again, it's a really back and forth process because the data back end of the data futures platform is currently being developed. The governance is now being put in place. And in the meanwhile, the Nature team still already has a lot of data coming in. So we're trying to manage this ourselves while trying to also be linked up with the bigger corporate picture. So it's really a back and forth process. It's not that the data futures platform backend is already 100% there and we're all doing. It's really about us testing these things on the thematic side and then trying to bring that in back to the corporates. So there's a lot of back and forth. Next slide, please. And just to show, this is just the Azure backend so that you can see how it looks like when you operationalize it. It's basically a lot of folders. We are trying to ingest all the data into a folder and then send it to the backend for processing. And after the processing, it goes into a cleaned up data lake where you can start to pull it for visualizations in different areas. So it could be at the project level, it could be at the portfolio level, and also can be combined with other types of data that are coming in from the governance team or the gender team, ideally. So we're actually not there yet, but that's where we're trying to get to. Next slide, please. And for visualization, we are basically using external software like Power BI or Tableau. We are also using Esri. So just because we have this data backend, now we do have the ability to connect with other types of visualization tools and just give the people the power to work with different data and analyze at the project level and at the portfolio level. So you can see that we do have a lot of survey data coming in with geo-referenced information. And again, going back to how can we operationalize the data principle, which was mentioning about privacy of data. that's something we have to now start scripting into our project documents or whenever we do these household surveys. So again, we're again in this messy process where we're waiting for the guiding post to come out, while we're also trying to figure out ourselves how this can be done for this thematic area. Next slide, please. And again, this is just to show, once we get this done, or as we start to strengthen this process, we will start to get more impact for projects. We will also be able to look at trends within the survey that we do. And then also, ultimately, we do want to empower the governments with different types of data that is combined with other sources such as satellite imageries. Next slide, please. The second project that I do want to speak about is the Digital for Energy Access. This is actually a very recently launched, actually we launched it yesterday, projects that we're starting to embark on. And as you know, energy is a big thing when it comes to green recovery. So we are trying to start to work more into this energy thematic area. And next slide, please. Oops, thank you. Again, we already do have a huge portfolio, well, actually huge, relatively big compared to World Bank and others, it's still small, but in UN, it is a pretty big portfolio where we can actually go and have some implementation in countries. So again, we're trying to leverage on this portfolio and trying to bring in different types of data and a digital platform to start to operationalize this much in a bigger way. And if you can go to the next slide. So the idea is that basically, as you all know, there's 1 billion people who are not connected to electricity as of now, and then 87% of these people are in rural areas. And so in the energy sector, people are starting to move away from the grid connection type of analysis and going into, the thing that is called optimal electrification plans. So instead of, trying to connect everybody to the grid, how can we utilize decentralized electrification methods is becoming the new question that a lot of people are asking. And to do this, there's a big gap in data, and there's also a big gap in financing. So this project that we're launching is going to try to bring together different stakeholders using the geospatial communication as something that basically glues the stakeholders together. And we are aware that there are impact investors. There's also a lot of interest around carbon credits, from people who want to offset, but that are not traditional countries. There's also renewable energy credits, crowdfunders, and investors out there that are looking into decentralized energy projects. And then there's all of these energy projects that we are doing on the ground, and we know that other stakeholders are doing on the ground. So the question is, how can we actually start to make these statistics into some geospatial information and try to pull these different actors together so that the financial flows start to flow into these decentralized electrification projects. So this is a platform that we're trying to build now, and it just really started. So I'll hopefully we can come back to you with much more updates next time. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so I guess actually there was one slide, but the other one was that just to mention that there was a green recovery tracker, the COVID observatory tracker. We actually launched it with the UNEP colleagues. If you're interested, I'll try to post the link after this into the chat box. But that was also launched, and it's been well received by a lot of people around the world. So I guess as a call for action, we are keen to work with the UNEP colleagues to collaborate on the green recovery data analytics, as well as these different platforms that we're trying to build on top of the data infrastructure that Rob has mentioned. So if there's anybody that's interested and we haven't reached out to, please do let me know, and we're happy to partner further. Thank you.
Reina, I'm sorry, I don't know where that slide went. It's
okay. I'll just put the link in the chat box. That's much more interesting.
Thanks very much. Can we, Rob, do we mind if we open up with some questions?
Yep, sure.
I'm going to just unfortunately take the floor one more time. Fantastic, Reina. Thank you so much. What's the broader strategy on kind of building a UN data ecosystem? Like, we've got UNEP on the line, we've got FAO on the line, we've got WHO, ITU. We've all sort of building our platforms, but can you give us a sense of how we can move to federate this so we're not duplicating and overlapping and really, is there a sense of building sort of an API UN infrastructure, a UN data cube? What can you tell us about the next big steps in terms of data federation?
Yeah, I have been discussing this with the Secretary General's office, in fact, because they drove the creation of the UN data strategy, and they would like, and it has a principle embedded in there about interoperability. I don't remember exactly what it says, but it's about interoperability and so on. And so they really would like to see this go forward. They have been in touch with us because they've been looking at the way we're bringing our back end together, and wondering how we might, essentially, as you said, kind of create a sort of a federated notion where we essentially are able to use APIs or whatever it is to kind of encourage better interoperability between those systems. I do think we need to do some work on some data standards and things, which will be a little tricky. But I think that if we can start getting a few players involved in it, we might be able to get kind of a critical mass to be able to start to bring something like that together. And probably we should look at, UNDP is, a larger player, but we need to get a couple other large players as well onto the same page. And then I think it's a little bit easier to get to the rest of the system. So I don't know exactly we're talking about what that strategy looks like from a pragmatic point of view.
Great, thanks. I see some hands up. I'm going to pass the floor over to David Ohem from UNFCCC. David, if you're still on the line, I see you have a question for Robert, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, Robert, and thanks for this very insightful meeting and presentations. And I'm sorry, I think all of your meetings are going this way, that everybody just wants to pick your brain because you have achieved something that no one else has achieved, probably, or still in the course. So the question is, as I also put in the chat, what are for you, like when you want to start, like what are main pillars of these kind of from an organization point of view, in terms of implementing something like you did, a digitalization strategy or some kind of moving along? What are really pillars that you say that needs to be part of the project? Otherwise, you can forget about it. Like it needs to, for example, as I put in our case, it's all voluntary, and you have voluntary task forces, and then nothing moves, right?
Thanks, David.
Yeah, so the response to that one, I kind of already said it, but excuse me, without the force of leadership, it's not going to happen. And so I know for sure that if UNDP had just sort of created a digital strategy from one department or something, and there wasn't strong leadership vision behind it, it just would not happen. Similarly with the crisis response to COVID, it wasn't easy for UNDP to come together. I used to work in World Food Programs. So for us responding to emergencies, there was a whole set of protocols. UNDP doesn't have that. It did take a bit of pressure from the top to bring the organization together and really start to operate more as an organization as opposed to just a lot of federated offices somehow. And that's really, really important. So that's number one. The second thing is that, you do need to have a certain amount of, as much as possible, you need to define your end vision. And to sort of say, what are the principles behind what you're trying to achieve as that end vision? And can we all agree to the principles? And then you work backward from there and try to say, okay, well, then what would it mean practically to actually achieve that? So everybody can agree, for example, on the principle that we must safeguard personal data. But then working backward from there, it's like, oh, well, you're going to take away my ability to, run my database over here and do this and that. But if you can agree on the principles, it gives you a good basis. So those are like just a couple things that come to mind. I'll probably think of more as we go along. But yeah, it's not easy by any stretch.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to pass the floor to Terry Gunning. I see that Terry had a question. Terry, if you want to come in.
Yeah, I'll stay off video because my connection isn't great, but I was just wondering if there's work that is being planned with agencies like IRENA, where you're looking to reduce the consumption from technology consumption and reduce the carbon footprint. And there's agencies like IRENA that are looking at renewable energies and work with nations and donors and this. And is there some sort of synergies planned for down the path?
Reina, I'm not sure if you've got anything from your team. My sort of high-level comment would be not a lot of specific stuff going on right now, but those discussions are starting for sure. And they're starting also in the context of discussing with tech companies themselves, many of whom, like Microsoft, are making commitments to, for example, I'm going to get it wrong, but something like by 2025, all of their data centers must be using renewable energy, or it's something, their target is something like that. And of course, they also want to go to a carbon negative consumption by a certain time, and I don't remember that time period either, I'm afraid. And we see this interest coming also from Amazon and Google and others who are those main kind of drivers of the data center growth and energy consumption. I also know that there are massive efforts on their part to increase energy efficiency from their data centers. So, you know, as data goes up, data gathered goes up exponentially, we don't see that same increase in energy consumption. And so far, they have been successful in doing that. But Reina, did you have anything to add from the Nature, Climate, Energy team?
No, we do have a partnership with IRENA, but not in that context. But this is a great point, and I think we can start discussing that as well.
There's sorry, Dave. One thing we have discussed putting it into something. We're working on an initiative as well on ethical foundations of technology. In other words, what would it take to build ethics into the technology platforms themselves? And part of that discussion, I think, needs to also be around the kind of energy efficiency side of things. In other words, as we think about ethical uses of technology, what would that take? And I think we'll find interest out there in industry to support that as well as IRENA.
Thanks, Rob. I'm curious, I'm going to have a follow-up question. You mentioned Google and Amazon and some of these other big platforms. Have we had discussions where we start asking them not only about their energy consumption and greening their ICT, but what they can do with their platform power to drive sustainable consumption? Have you been having those kind of conversations and where do those conversations look like? Thanks.
So yes, we've been discussing with all of them, more Microsoft and Google than Amazon, although Amazon's got a strong interest in understanding better supply chain efficiency for sure. They are all very interested in how they can work in this space for sure, and not just in the kind of environmental or climate related applications, but across the board. And so there are a couple efforts out there to try to pull together some of the capacities and expertise and data and make it more available. So we're joining a partnership called the World Bank Data Development Data Partnership, I think it is, which essentially the World Bank has already made agreements with a number of tech companies on access to certain pieces of data and services, and then consolidates that in terms of sort of set of rules and guidelines on how to access those. And so that's a sort of a focal point. With some of the companies that are not included in that, we are doing that ourselves within UNDP to kind of create like a catalog of partnership services and assets that we have. So making available, for example, talking to, so Facebook has their Data for Good platform or initiative. So we now have an agreement with Facebook on how to access data from that to be able to use. We have an agreement with WhatsApp on using WhatsApp as a platform for distributing or disseminating information about small and medium enterprises, and so on and so forth. So we're sort of piecing it together, and I think that the more that we can try to aggregate this and make a kind of common access stream, the better. Global Pulse also has a relationship with Twitter on accessing Twitter feeds. So it's those kinds of arrangements, I think, that will help.
Yeah, that's great. I guess the question I was also moving towards is more like looking at the business models of these platforms and asking how they can begin to propel forward sustainable products, sustainable behaviors, sustainable lifestyles. So I think that's something I'd like to do with codes. Exactly that, is have that conversation and try to create some momentum in that domain.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question, David. Yeah, I mean, we know Amazon's work in supply chain is huge. They have just made the announcement of 100,000 electric trucks and, you know, a bunch of stuff like that. But we haven't engaged with Microsoft. We have engaged directly on their carbon negative strategy, but with the others, we haven't done that yet.
Good. Well, that's something for us to work on together. I'm going to look, we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to look for hands or questions in the chat. I think that James has had his hand up for a while, so I'm going to ask if James Castillo can take the floor.
Hi, thanks, David. In the world of filmmaking, filmmakers are always asked about marketing and distribution, and I haven't seen any discussion about how do we market, you know, the solutions that is being developed, because I think that is really crucial.
Absolutely. Now, if your question is about how do we market, I mean, I see this in a couple different ways. Within UNDP's network itself, we must do a better job of marketing internally. So in other words, innovations from one country moving to another is part of the scaling process. And a huge part of the scaling process is even just understanding what's actually out there, so discoverability. But let's face it, as a sector, when it comes to the kinds of things that we're working on that might interest others, we are not as strong on marketing as we can and should be. So I don't have any magic bullets there, but 100% agree with you.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks, James. I think we have a question from Kenyatta. Kenyatta, if you can take the floor, please. Kenyatta, if you're on, we cannot hear you, so we will wait. Oh, go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, David. I just want to understand, how do you respond to priorities at the large scale, including all risk factors associated, if any? What has been the lesson learned, and what are the precaution measures that you have implemented? Because I've been working within different projects, and when it's come to this change requests, we have been having problems, especially with fundings, because to implement only small functionalities, it costs a company more than £50,000. So you have been working with more than 116 countries. So how do you manage this? It's just a question I would like to raise and understand.
Thanks very much, Kenyatta.
If I've understood the question in terms of how do we prioritize what gets support, you know, we get requests everywhere and on all sorts of stuff, and how do we prioritize what actually gets support, including resources? There's a number of different ways. In the realm of management or the kind of operational systems, we actually have kind of a regular call for proposals to our country offices for what they need to be, what they need in terms of management systems support on the technology side, because we have a special what we call ICT reserve budget that can be allocated to support that. And what we do is with the call for proposals, we aggregate them into common buckets and then try to work on solutions for that. So for example, in the last round of calls that we had, 9 different countries asked for different solutions related to managing projects. And so we're basically taking all of those requirements as one and trying to build a solution that can work for everybody. Excuse me. In terms of on the programmatic side, how do we prioritize in country support? When we have many different countries, we have to, it's tricky, but the primary and direct support goes on the basis of what we think is the biggest impact. And so we have to kind of evaluate those requests in the light of the potential impact that it can have, and in a sense, also the scalability of the approach. Because as a transformation team, we do not have the ability to fund everybody's activity, but what we can do is look for the things that are most scalable that can then be turned into broader solutions that also become more attractive for external funding or reprioritize funding somewhere else. So I hope I've understood the question properly. Yeah, it's not, again, that one is not easy, but it's something we have to do primarily on impact and scalability.
Thanks, Rob. That's a tough question. So let's move to the final question, and then we have to close down. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Jan Kennis.
Thank you very much for allowing me to ask the last question. So very good presentation. I'm working at Enable, which is a Belgian development cooperation agency, national agency, and I'm wondering, is there a way for national agencies also to collaborate on part of what you're doing? Because one of the many things I've seen in digital transformation, I'm lead expert in digital for development, is that we all tend to reinvent the wheel. So is there a way that national agencies can work together with you or use, for instance, Spark Blue as a platform? Thank you.
That is a great question. I definitely think that's a space where we need to work on. Internally in the UN, we have a UN Innovation Network that does a lot of sharing of experiences. There are 3,000 members to that network. I'm a co-chair of it. That's a venue where we can really, there's some publications and we can really draw on that. Some of those meetings are open for external participants as well. But I think what you're pointing to is something a little more than that, which is quite organic. You're pointing to something that, so one of the things that I know that we need to do that we have not done is, again, it's about this discoverability. How do we elevate what we're doing, and taking the marketing question as well? How do we really just share with the world what we're doing in an easy way that reduces friction? So we have, I have a kind of a glimmer of an idea around this that is based on some of what we did in COVID response. So I mentioned that in the response to COVID, we started tracking the digital responses, and we've tracked 257 of them, I think it is. That's in a publicly accessible, easy to use Airtable. It's on the Airtable platform. That was our sort of minimum viable product to sort of test. We actually saw a lot of demand or interest out there from one part of UNDP to another part to access that and understand what's going on. I do think that we could build out a better platform to start sharing some of these experiences that would be perhaps underpinned with the consultation type or dialogue type of ability of Spark Blue. Also maybe with some more kind of live conversations and more ad hoc kinds of sharing sessions and things to really start to build a culture of sharing. But that is something that I would really love to work on together. How can we really kind of put things out there in the frictionless way that is easy to access, but also easy for our country colleagues and others to actually create or populate that? because it's also, you know, tricky to stop in the middle of what you're doing and fill out a bunch of knowledge management templates and then submit them somewhere for peer review. And then, you know, I mean, we're not in that space. We have to make it much easier. So I'd love to work on it.
Great, Rob. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our session. I think one of the things I love about the digital space is just how collaborative it is, and how much, you know, cooperation we can have in building this digital ecosystem within the UN, within our partners, within member states. I just love that potential, and I think your presentation really, you know, emphasized that. Really enjoyed your honesty, your candor, the practicality of your presentation, and just wanted to thank you very much. Wanted to thank Reina and Amadou as well, and I don't think Nina took the floor, but I know Nina was listening, so thank you, Nina, for all your work on Spark Blue. We're loving the platform in codes, and we look forward to working with you to continue to develop it. So on behalf of the UNEP Digital Discovery Sessions, thank you again, Rob. Really appreciate your time, and best wishes going forward in your digital journey.
Thanks, David, and thanks for your leadership in bringing this together. It's great.
All right, cheers, Rob. Thanks again, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, sirs. Bye-bye.